changed. Here to discuss is attorney and constitutional scholar at the Ave Maria School of Law, Mark Smith. Professor, what is the precise issue before the Supreme Court?
The question, Trey, is whether or not Joe Biden, as the king of America, if you will, has the ability to forgive $500 billion in student loan debt, impacting 43 million Americans without having to consult with Congress. The people who are under the Constitution actually have the legal responsibility for giving out money and appropriating funds. That is the question before the Supreme Court. And I think it's pretty obvious where the Supreme Court's going to come out, which is not in Joe Biden's favor.
You know, Professor, I thought you were right. And then I started reading stories after the oral arguments, and the left-leaning media just fell in love with the arguments of the Solicitor General. And now they think, hey, maybe this is a jump ball. So put on your professor hat. What is the argument that he does have the authority?
The argument that Joe Biden has the authority is under a statute that was enacted right after September 11th and the attacks on our country that's called the HEROES Act. Under the language of that statute that Congress passed says basically that the Department of Education, when it comes to student loans, has the ability to modify or waive certain requirements associated with student loans. Now, of course, if you look carefully at the language, Trey, what it's really saying is we want to make sure that if there's a national emergency, we don't punish people that have taken out student loans. But what's going on here, of course, is much different. That Joe Biden is not just trying to make sure that individuals that have taken out student loans are not punished. What he's basically doing is rewarding them and giving them a massive $500 billion grant. And even Chief Justice John Roberts, who I would consider really kind of the middle of the Supreme Court, really scoffed at the notion that Joe Biden, as president, has that kind of legal authority that he can usurp from Congress, which at the end of the day, as you know, is responsible for appropriating our taxpayer money through the federal government.
Professor, do you think we will ever get back to a time when someone says, hey, look, this is a really, really good idea. I just don't have the power to do it. I mean, will we ever get back to the humility of saying, great idea, I cannot do it?
Well, I think it's fair to say that originalists and constitutionalists are always in that posture, Trey, where they're worried about the constitutional form of government. Because as you know, the whole purpose of the Constitution is to make sure that our individual freedoms and our liberties are protected from government overreach. The problem is in America today is that you have a large group of Americans that see government as a force for good, and they're willing, frankly, to trample over individual liberties in the name of expanding the growth of government to do what they consider to be good. And I think we see this all across the board among certain Americans. So when it comes to those Americans who think government is a force for good, no, there will be no argument that says that government lacks that authority, because it's always green light for bigger and more government spending and more taxation and more regulation. So when it comes to those people, Trey, no, I don't think you'll see any discussion about a check and a balance on the growth of government.
All right. I do not want to put our viewers to sleep by talking about standing. I mean, it put me to sleep in law school. I don't want to talk about that. But it seemed like Justice Kavanaugh and maybe Justice Coney Barrett were maybe open to saying, we're not going to agree he's got the power, but we're going to say the plaintiffs didn't have standing. Do you think that's possible?
Yeah, I think anything is possible. Under Article 3 of the United States Constitution, a federal court, as you know, only has authority to take on what are known as cases or controversies, and that requires the plaintiffs to have standing, which means that they have to show that they've been injured by something that the defendant, in this case Joe Biden, has done. And in this case, we have, for example, the state of Missouri that says that we have a state-chartered entity that's responsible for servicing student loans. And the reality is, if you waive $500 billion in student loan debt, we and our entity in the state of Missouri is going to lose all that money associated with servicing those loans. And thus we've been hurt and injured and have standing.
That was a great short explanation of standing. I wish my law school professor, I wish you'd taught me in law school. I wouldn't have wasted a semester of my life. Thank you, Professor, for joining us on a Sunday night.